Sí, 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 probando, probando, probando. ¿Me escuchan? No me oye. Ah, sí, sí me oye. Gracias.
Se oye perfecto.
¿Puede hablar un poco, profesor Raimundo,
Sí, se oye muy bien desde este lado, sin
por
ningún
favor?
problema, al menos hasta ahora. ¿Me escuchan ustedes? ¿Me escuchan? ¿No me escuchan? Parece que no.
Ok, gracias.
Hola.
En la transmisión está
Ya me-
bien, ahorita para que lo escuchemos de este lado, perfecto.
Muy bien.
¿Se está escuchando bien, Javier?
Yo sí te oigo bien, David.
Gracias. Ya vamos, disculpen el retraso. Eh, Estamos llegando a la facultad.
De este, sí se escuchan bien, pero ahorita voy a conectar la bocina para que todos los escuchemos bien.
Muy bien.
¿Pueden hablar otro poco, por favor? Solo una prueba más, ya tengo conectada la bocina.
Se sigue oyendo bien, sin ningún problema, desde aquí, desde Granada. ¿Me escuchan ustedes? Yo les estoy hablando, pero no sé si me escuchan. ¿No?
Yo sí te escucho, Raimundo. No sé, Javier. Javier, ¿escuchas a Raimundo?
Parece que no nos está oyendo.
Ajá.
Sí, sí lo escucho, pero estoy tratando de configurar la bocina.
Hasta ahora ha mejorado mucho el sonido con respecto a ayer. Se está oyendo mucho mejor. No sé qué hicieron, pero manténganlo así.
creo que ya la tengo conectada. No sé si pueden intentar.
¿Qué pasó?
Se escucha bien, al menos hasta ahorita. ¿Tú me escuchas, David?
Sí lo escucho, profesor Raimundo, pero no sé por qué no me da el audio del Zoom. O sea, ya probé con música y sí me la reproduce. Bueno, se
¿Con
escucha
la
en la bocina,
conexión de
pero
Bluetooth no has podido?
Zoom no se escucha en la bocina. Entonces voy a checar
Ah,
rápido
qué
a ver
raro.
qué es lo que...
Mm, vaya. Entonces hay que pedir las otras bocinas otra vez. Yes. Ay,
If you have problems, I can begin with that.
with the audio. With the audio again. We have ¿cómo se dice? Bocinas parlants.
But I can be
Here.
too.
Yes.
Speakers.
Yes.
The microphone, no.
Yes, you're right. Hola, Javier. Perfecto. Muy bien. ¿Mm? Sí, sí, para todos los de la sala yo creo que sí.
Ya.
Muy bien. ¿Listos? Cuando tú estés listo. Bien. ¿Listo? Bien, este es el segundo día de las jornadas de Lógica no Clásica de los grupos de investigación SIGNO, MON, PRINCIPHIA y de la Academia Mexicana de Lógica. We are in the second day of jornadas. The next conference is from Alicia Pasos, and she is in Autonomous University of Mexico City, and researcher to PRINCIPHIA and researcher to SIGNO. Adelante, Alicia.
Okay. This is a text from Kant. It will separate all the knowledge that we must obtain from objects and reflect upon the use of understanding in general. Then we discover the rules of it which are quintessentially necessary for any purpose and independently of a particular object of thought. Because without them, we will not think at all. Hence, these rules can be comprehended a priori. That science of the necessary laws of understanding and reason in general, we just call logic. That was said by Immanuel Kant in the year 18. How do you say 1800?
1874. Yes. No.
No, 1800.
Okay.
Well, in this year, logic as the science of the law of thought was considered necessary and a priori. The idea is logic.
18th century.
18th century, okay. Logic is an a priori science of the necessary laws of thought, a science, therefore, of the correct use of understanding and reason in general, but not in a subjective sense. That is not according to psychology, there are some things, but in an objective sense that is according to a priori principles, how it ought to think. Okay, that is the logic. Use, we can consider it as a human capacity. This attribution is sufficient to distinguish between a faculty and its use. Thus, there could exist a faculty that not only allows but also guides certain uses. Just as we assume, without adding too much ontological weight, that we have an ability to utter grammatical statements, no se oye, ¿no?
Yes.
Yeah. We can believe that we possess a faculty that guides our inferences. This is logic, but it is necessary to pause for a moment to point out that we might find other candidate faculties that, if not to be identified with rationality, should at least be considered part of rationality. Perhaps there are actions that we also consider rational, although they do not stem from an inference. For example, it could be considered rational to cross the street where the traffic light is green, even if we do so automatically and without inference. It might even be argued that our instincts are, in a certain sense, rational. That would not be, for instance, it would be rational to flee if we come across an encaged tiger. That would not be rational in the sense of a decision motivated by a correct inference, but rather an action that is better to take than not, with the natural object of survival. In an objective sense, one that evaluates the action rather than its causes, fleeing from a rational, whether it is instinctive or the result of deliberation. So, if we wish to judge the rationality of from a third-person viewpoint, it could be considered sensible to find rational both the action that are produced of our inferences and those that are the result of any other mechanism if they lead to the correct end. But that kind of rationality will not be the rationality associated with the logical system. So, the idea of rationality is broader than the idea of a rational inference, but we will concentrate in the rationality of a normative inference. I will focus solely on the problem of the normativity of logic. Specifically, I will examine the extent to which normative systems present and potentially govern inference. The concern for the normativity of logic arises the concern for the normativity of a system that describes not the reason, a term that can refer to many things, but the faculty of reasoning. Okay, Gilbert Harman refers to the logic whose normativity we are considering as what he calls a theory of inference, and contrasts it with a theory of reasoning. The theory of inference says what follows from what, not what we can or should infer, we humans. There are constraints such as short-term memory capacity and limited time to make decisions that restrict certain uses of this theory of inference. So, Harman's delineation between logic as an abstract construct and the practical norms of reasoning prompts the author to scrutinize the extent to which logic is normative in the context of daily reasoning. According to Harman, once we realize that principles of deductive logic are not norms of reasoning in and of themselves, gaps open up between the two. So we could have a logic of inference, but logic of inference do not directly normative to our way of thinking as human limited beings. This is the idea. So, since they are different, logic of reasoning and logic of inference, it is essential to connect them if logical normativity is based on guiding common inference. This connection could be achieved by linking logic with the theory of reasoning using something that philosophers used to call a bridge principle or bridge principles, maybe more than one. So logic cannot be normative unless we find a bridge principle to connect logic as a theory of inference with a theory of reasoning. And this is some way the way as it is usually considered the problem of rationality of our human inferences. So the idea of this author is if we can connect logic of inference with the theory of argumentation, well, we have explanation of our theory of reasoning. However, in this line of argument, there is an assumption of the correctness of logic itself as a theory of correct inference, which is not questioning. It is strange that they do not question that. The problem for them is to find a bridge principle, but logic is fine for them. Logic as a theory of inference is clearly normative. But why trust in logic? If it no longer reflects the rationality of the ordered cosmos of the Greek or the omniscient mind of a God, but the human capacity, and if we are only facing rules created by humans, how can we be sure that it actually shows what follows from what, even in ideal circumstances? Before considering logic as normative for reasoning, we must first justify why we accept logic itself. This is the idea. This more basic and fundamental challenge is addressed by logical positivism through the argument of analyticity. However, so they say logic is rational because it is analytic. So it can be established a priori, not because these are transcendental principles as Kant think, but because they are analytical. However, the difficulty arises again with the advent of new logics. Given this diversity in logic and the fact that each system, from its semantic perspective, sees certain principles and rules as analytically true or valid, how to decide which system is the appropriate one? Yes, we have several logics, so the appropriate one. Nixon Goodman, as early as in 1979, clearly outlined the reasons why the certainty of logical tracks poses an unsolvable problem. Yes, this is as early as in 1979. We take theorems for granted because of their inferential warranty. But why consider valid axioms that, by definition, do not follow from anywhere else? Their analyticity constitutes a circular argument. A semantics leading to the analyticity of the set of formulas, which is precisely the institution, simply confirms that the analytical statements are exactly what they were expected to be. Likewise, the validity of an argument presupposes the correctness of its structure, taking the justification ad infinitum. This argument, this is important, do not depend on the existence of alternative logics. This argument is prior to the creation of alternative systems. If we had only one logical system to consider, as Goodman has in his time, the question for its validity is exactly the same. Why trust logic? Well, there are two kinds of answers to this. One is intuitions, and this is a priori, and the other is uses, and this is a posteriori. Intuitions are the form of our thinking in general, intuition as the form of our thinking in general, that's the idea of Kant, of intuitions, do not warrant we are correctly thinking. For Kant, it's born because Kant says if we don't think this way, we don't think at all. But we could say, well, these are where our intuitions, but why not to think that way? Intuitions represent the way we guess how to think. but we can guess wrong and we can think wrong. So the question is why we should trust in intuitions just as intuitions. We could have a wrong intuition. Well, so if this is the way a priori, the way a posteriori we have uses. So we can define reasoning well as reasoning in the way that people do in their daily lives. These present a lot of problems. Every use of a rule is an argument in favor of it. This is if we identify a correct logic with the use of its rules. Every use of a rule is an argument in favor of it. So there are not arguments against a rule. If people use a rule, if they don't have a rule, they are not incorrect because anytime you use a rule is a use, and if it is a use, it is correct. So incorrect arguments should be arguments people do not use, but they are not cases of this since people do not utter them. Because if they utter, they are correct. They are correct. This is the first problem. The second, rules derive from more basic rules. For example, we have, let's suppose we have the law excluded middle and modus ponens, and we can infer a constructive syllogism. So these more complex rules should be acceptable because it is derived from the others, but if people do not utter, do not think this, let's suppose people don't use constructive syllogism, this is not acceptable because this is not used. Okay. The third problem, mistakes are not considered mistakes since they are uses of the arguments. Okay, so a possible solution is we can see, you can analyze the uses in the meta discourse of the users. Meta discourses should be considered. Rejection of arguments as incorrect must be in this level. But these considerations introduces incoherence criteria to evaluate uses because some people uses some rules and some other people in the meta level says these rules are not correct. So we have incoherence in uses and wait. There should be some way to solve this, but there we can say uses are not in a simple way the answer. Yes, but if we could solve all the main problem is this. However, uses that say the fact that people act in a certain way, routinely does not, the fact that people act in a certain way does not imply that it is the correct way. Yes, this is not normal. People do it, but why it is the way we have to think? Yes. We could say, well, for definition, yes, the correct way is the people they use the language, so this is correct, but this has no normative consequence. So this is a form of the naturalistic fallacy. We try to justify a normative system a posteriori, we have the problem of naturalizing fallacy. Okay, this is not a very invention, but this is another criteria. Empirical adequation, not to the use, but to an aim. The idea is a system is rational, it has empirical adequation to the aim it is proposed to. And this is an example, an empirical adequate computational system. A man called João Ignacio da Silva, a Brazilian, designing a robot. The name of the robot was Amy, with the sole capability of moving in an unstructured environment by implementing a logic. By implementing the computational logic of Newton da Costa's paraconsistent logic. Without, the idea is the robot had to move in a room without colliding with surrounding objects. Yes, they put the robot about this size in the middle of a room, chairs around, and the robot moved without colliding with the objects. With this goal in mind, Da Silva reinterpreted the annotated paraconsistent logic of Da Costa to fit the needs of his device. Okay. How much? David, how many time?
Yes, 11 minutes, but 11 minutes. We can take 5 minutes only.
Okay.
Then 16 minutes. If you want to ask questions.
Okay. Well, I will not explain the logic, but the idea is that the robot has two sensors and with both sensors he received two signals, and these signals must be, they are some kind of two eyes, so they receive one signal in the right eye and the other in the other eye, and if they, and why, so one eye say there is an object, the other say there is an object. If there is an object, he stops. If one eye says there is an object and the other eye says there is no object, the robot moves right. So the idea is the robot has a paraconsistent logic. It receives two colliding inputs, and he do something. He do not infer everything from an inconsistency, but he decides to move right or to move left. If inputs are inconsistent, he moves right or left. If inputs are positive, they stop. He stops the engine, the robot. And if they are negative, he goes up. Well, this is doesn't. That's the idea. This is the robot uses an interpretation of Da Costa logic. What can be concluded from the example? It can be said that any and the robot exhibits a logic of perception, and a logic by which it infers an interpretation of sensory data from the data itself. it does not imply, yes, the example does not imply that humans have a logic of perception. We may not, that's it. It does not imply that the robot efficiency in using this logic is a good reason to consider it as a good way of thinking in general. This is for the robot. Not a good way to model a perceptual reasoning. Just a perceptual reasoning for any. It is just an argument in favor of this logic as reasonable for the aim it was applied. This is the idea. The robot moves in its environment, colliding with the objects around it. It is clear, therefore, that the logic employed is successful, and it is therefore acceptable for these purposes. The logic is acceptable for these purposes. This logic, para-consistent annotated logic, is then reasonable for that use. We could say it is rational, but we will replace the idea of rational by reason. So we have a justification for that logic. It is adequate in this context. This justification has a normative role. It is reasonable to use this logic for this aim, the motion of the robot. So we have an empirical adequacy. We have a new kind of empirical adequacy as a criterion. Computational models of logic are not a way to simulate humanism. They are just ways to test logic for specific aims. They can be tested against its aims. Testing a logic against its aims represents an empirical adequacy criterion to test a logic. So the same way, in the case of human reasoning behavior, it can be tested against its own aims, not the aims of the robot, but the different aims of the human being. This is an empirical test for evaluating logic that does not face the problem mentioned before about uses. This test allows logic a normative role when accepted as appropriate for some goal. It allows for plurality of logic, but does not exclude a priori unicity. Does not exclude a priori unicity of logic. Unicity of logic could be true in case some specific logic will show up better for some aim that others. It does not warrant that an acceptable logic is the better logic for this aim. One logic could be as good as another. One logic can be reasonably good even if it is not the better one. One logic can be discovered to be better than another that was previously used. So a justification of a logic is objective, but is fallible and can be replaced by the justification of a better alternative to it. So this is a way of naturalizing logic, a way that allows for logic and normative logic. And that's all.
Thank you, Alicia. It's time to questions or commentaries.
I have one.
Yes. Hola, Alicia. Bueno, lo ves en español, quizás es más fácil ahorita. Sí, sí, me entendió. Okay, no, in English. No. I can understand. Maybe you can formulate in more, in more words the relation between empirical adequacy and the normative role of logic. I can see or I can think what's the relation between empirical adequacy and the normative role of logic.
Well, we don't have normative principles. That's the same problem that in ethics. It is impossible to find universal principles, normative, that have some, that gives us some reason to act. Yes. So, sometimes in ethics they speak of instrumental rationality. Yes. So a norm is rational for a name in ethics. So if I want to be happy, then it is good to make me happy. For it's still good that the others give me gifts and everything else. Because this is if I accept the aim, so I have a reason to act. And this is what it means normative. And well, this is what is happening here. The objectivity of the normativity of logic here is we have a reason to use this logic better than the other ones because this logic allows me to get this result. For example, this logic, the paraconsistent logic of Da Costa, makes the robot move without colliding with the chairs. This is normative because it is a reason to act, and this is objective because it depends on facts.
So your proposal is if in certain case we need some model of reasoning, that's a good reason for subscribe some time of logic, and this form of this logic will be normal.
Yes. This is you can see in the case of the logic of Amy, since this is a very simple logic, you can see it as a tool. It is not really important if we see an inferential tool. But in more complex logics and in more complex inferences, it is important that what we are analyzing is a logic, because a logic will be adequate if I can infer things that, for example, that are true, well, the premises are true. If I can infer how to build a if I can infer how to go to the moon and not to any other place in the space from the Einstein theory. I have the Einstein theory, and I wanted a theory that I want a theory to take consequences may be true or may be useful. Yes, not necessarily true. And this will depend on the logic I use. For example, if I use classical logic, in cases of inconsistency, I infer everything, and so this is not useful to go to the moon, for example. Okay? I don't want to say that the logic is true when I can infer two statements from two statements, because this presupposes too much. I can have other objectives to use an inferential complex system. Yes, and it has got a normative role. If I, for example, is one logical and not the other, go to the moon or build a bridge that not for that does not for that's the idea.
Thanks, Alicia. I have another question, but the copyright maybe. So I have the microphone. So, Alicia, thank you very much. Great talk. Before computational model, my question is so general. What does empirical justification of logic mean? Okay, that is the headline of your talk. For example, according to Kant, to his project of general logic, logic is not the science of correct reasoning, but the formal condition that allow us to think. Yes, that is just general logic project. So, do you think are there in this project one empirical justification of logic?
I think the only possible justification of logic is a posteriori. Yes. So, I'm not sure I am understanding your question. Every justification of a normative logic is by an a posteriori method.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, if you think that the logic is the science of correct reasoning,
Yes.
maybe the justification of logic is not empirical. Maybe.
No.
Maybe.
Okay.
But if you think one concept of logic as Kant thinking a general logic project,
yeah.
Maybe if you think the logic as a formal condition to think to everyone. So in this moment, maybe there are an empirical justification of logic. So my question is, are there in this project one empirical justification of logic from your point of view?
Maybe the last
From your point of view?
The last question.
Are there in a project one empirical justification of logic from your point of view?
There are empirical justifications.
When Kant is talking about general logic
yes.
project.
Okay, Kant speak about general logic because Kant think logic is this thing without which we can't think at all. But Kant think this way that allow us to think is only one way. So if there are many ways of making inferences, and there are, if there are, so there is not a general logic. There are too many ways of thinking. Now, you can't do, you can't know this a priori because let's suppose something that may be false. Let's suppose that all the mankind has the same logic. Yes? So logic could be known, the logic that constitutes the faculty of human beings could said to be known a priori because we could, because this is in the mind of everybody. So in the better case, this is not true, but in the better case, a person could think, reflect, and realize how he thinks. And so the person, if thinks enough, we know this faculty universal to all human. The problem is that this is psychological. This does not guarantee that this logic will be the better way to arrive to the ends people has got for different things. We use our logic because this is the way we think. But it could not be the better one. There could be another better logic than this. So our logic as something our logic as a product of our evolution not necessarily is justified. It is the things, but it is not the best. And we could find another logic, for example, studying logic. So this a priori study that come when thinking is not normative. It's not normative. Could be possibly if it were the case that every human think equal than the others, if there is only one faculty of thinking, could exist this logic, but it's not normative.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The last question, Natalia. So,
I will be quick. I will be quick.
Yeah, well,
Natalia and Lorenzo.
thank you very much, Alicia, for such an interesting talk about this very important problem. I would like to understand your project. Is it that you're looking for an epistemic justification of logic? Because I think, like, existence of logic, you don't need to justify the existence of it, no, it isn't, that's all. I also would like to ask you, how is it that you are understanding, what is it logic? Are you understanding as a like big science or as a logical system? Because I see that you are a pluralist, and if we don't conflate like realism about logic with monism, I would understand your project as provide an epistemic justification of logic from a psychological point of view. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, that's very interesting. Since I am pluralistic, it is necessary to define logic because logic is not every formal system. So we have to distinguish among logic from other formal systems that are not differential. And this is not so easy, but the main requirement is that logic needs a notion of consequence. So every formal logic system is a system that relates statements by a notion of consequences. We have to define this notion of consequence in a general way that allows the different notions of consequences. But we need to define logic to say, yes, logic is a science. But it's a science that accepts a lot of logical systems. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Marisa. Thanks for your presentation. That was very interesting. I practically agree with your presentation, even if I think also that logical systems are already justified by themselves, in the sense that they are idealized objects insofar as they are in good shape, so there are no mistakes, they are justified. But this is also a view of logic that is a bit old-fashioned. Also depicts an image of logic as something abstract, unknowing, without a contact with the reality. So it is good to find an empirical justification, to see which aspects of human reasoning, also from the psychological point of view, or human intellectual objects. If they came as forms that suggested the creation of some logics, but not only, these logics are also empirical justified. For instance, I always thought that the mathematician justifies classical logic, because when the mathematician makes proofs, the mathematician is not interested to start from false premises, and this is important in classical logic. It is interested to reach true sentences. This is one aspect of the mathematician, because it is the mathematician that makes proofs. So it is an empirical justification of classical logic. Then there is the mathematician that creates theory. So in that case, we need abduction. Thus, in the case of the physician, also the physician uses pieces of classical logic, but also other logics. And you have shown the interesting case of the robots. There are the application of fuzzy logic. So thank you. You, with your presentation, remember to us that logic is alive. And it is applicable in many cases. And this is a pragmatic and empirical justification of the existence of logic that considered only a technical virtuosity. Okay.
Okay. Okay.
Yes. Okay.
It was a comment.
Yes.
You agree?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot for your talk, Alicia. Applause for her, please. Well, the next conference is
Yes.
Professor Carlos Eduardo González from the Autonomous University, Autonomous Mexico City University. He is full professor of that unit, and he is the research of the project PRINCIPHIA of the Autonomous City of Mexico University. So, Professor Carlos, the show is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot, David, for the invitation. And well, I'm gonna talk about this, which has some connections with all that has been presented here. Well, the name of the talk is this, reference and the building of commensurability. So let's start. Okay, there's some problem there. Okay, yes. Well, first, we have this very classical idea of a problem that was pointed out by Kuhn and Fayaben about 60 years ago, 70 years ago. And well, it changed, and around 60s, 70s, it started becoming something of this sort, semantic incommensurability. Basically, the problem seemed to be that if scientific terms derive their meanings from semantic relationships within the theoretical context in which they are employed, and from a semantic point of view, we cannot distinguish between theoretical and observational terms, because they would all derive meaning the same way. Then when theory changes, then both kinds of terms would change their meanings. And of course, from a logical point of view, it would be difficult to compare these different theories, because negation of theory with different, sentences with different meanings from a theory wouldn't be the negation of the original propositions. So this puzzled philosophy of science when it was pointed out at that time. And well, the first way that was explored was pointed out by Schaeffer already in 1967 and much refined in 1982. Well, as long as reference could be maintained with terms, then rational comparison would be possible. But of course, you know that the theory of reference at that time was changing, was into trouble, and there were some new proposals appearing. And well, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, talking about Kitcher and Putnam, etc. But part of this developed in this case of incommensurability with Martin, Field, Kitcher, Papineau, Leplin, David, and Sternly, who developed more this strategy for finding possible reference intersections, or they said, well, it might not be necessary that each term refers exactly to the same, but if there's some sort of intersection in the reference, that might be enough for logical incompatibility between theories, and then the logical comparison between them. But of course, again, the problem was the theory of reference. The problem arose in the middle of those descriptivist theories of reference, where terms derive their meanings from their context. So if that is the case, when theories change, then meaning changes, and it is puzzling how to continue comparing terms or theories, or how to have logical incompatibility between theories. They might be, as Kuhn said, they might be talking about different worlds. So they're talking about different worlds, how do you compare that? But of course, we know that Crick, Putnam, developed these theories of causal theories of reference. Well, they have, of course, criticism, objections, and refinements. For example, those by David, Kitcher, Weiner, etc. You know that causal theories of reference proposed that the causal connection by this kind of baptism, when we use terms to call something, well, they started thinking about names like proper names, but that can be extended to whatever. And then how this is communicated causally, that might be part of the reference. But of course, the problem here is if the reference was fixed only that way, then maybe reference wouldn't change. That's one of the problems. It might be so fixed that it wouldn't change, and we have seen that reference changes. And it's also unclear how we could agree on the reference of terms, for example, for general nouns. Yeah. So those are some of the criticisms by Kitcher, Weiner, and then they all proposed a possibility of mixed theories, where you have causal relationships plus the definitions or semantic relationships, which I think is correct, but I think they were missing a very important aspect, which is what I call this pragmatic aspect. I think maybe one of the most interesting of these theories was that by Putnam, who proposed that as we develop our idea of reference with different terms, it can be proper names or names of things, dogs, cats, trees, whatever. We develop stereotypes. We are not really definitions of those words, but in those stereotypes, we can associate, for example, a child develops his stereotype of a dog. Sorry?
Mental representation of
there might be mental representation of things. If is a dog, part of the stereotype of a dog might whereas if somebody has very good relationships with dogs, they might think they are lovely, cute, and whatever. And so stereotypes include these emotional aspects as well as some ideas that might be visual thinking of how things look like, that might be tactile, how dogs feel, or auditory, how they sound, etc. So as you see, these are not really definitions of terms, but stereotypes. Now, something which I think might supplement very well this theory of Putnam is that he didn't quite, and I will use one of his examples to show that I disagree with that part of him. He didn't quite take into consideration this, how we but the things we do with people, animals, and things. This pragmatic thing. For example, I think that when we learn the reference of water, we develop these kind of stereotypes that Una said. But of course, for us, water is also something we use to drink, to wash our hands, to have a bath, to swim in, etc. And also, these pragmatic interactions with water or with whatever, with chickens or with eggs or with vegetables or with chairs, is part of what builds the stereotypes that develop our references. And well, I will recall this thought experiment by Putnam. Maybe you remember that he proposed, when he proposed this theory of reference, thought experiment where he said, okay, let's imagine that in the future, human beings arrive in a planet where we see something that flows in rivers and seas and etc. And so it looks a lot like water, but when analyzed chemically, it is not H2O, it is XYZ. And his conclusion is, well, that is not water. I disagree. And I disagree because of this. If I would imagine that in that situation, if human beings get to this place and they see beings there that drink that liquid, that swim in that liquid, that use that liquid to wash their clothes or whatever, there would be grounds to debate whether that is not water or we have to review our chemical theory. Because from this pragmatic point of view, we would be tempted, well, maybe that's water, different kind of water. And maybe water is not necessarily H2O everywhere, but maybe there are different chemical structures for water. I'm not saying that this debate would be settled one or the other way, but that there will be grounds to debate because of these pragmatic considerations. I'm gonna go a little bit deeper into this, but taking just into consideration those pragmatic considerations, it seems to be as grounded to say that is not water if we don't want to change our chemical theory, or that might be water because it is used for exactly the same things that water is used on Earth. Well, maybe what needs to be reviewed is our theory of chemistry. But this gets more interesting when we consider how, in my opinion, reference is developed in the sciences, in European sciences, which is the science we basically know about. And that is what I call the technification of intervention and observation. Technification, in my opinion, is basically standardized procedures to reduce variability from performance. And in my opinion, that is a survival strategy that has been developed everywhere by human beings, and not only by human beings, apparently chimpanzees and maybe some other, well, the orcas, apparently they have something of the sort, like fixed procedures for chasing, or for hunting. Well, but so this, let's think of this as something which in my opinion is also quite interesting, because I don't think it has received due attention in the, well, both in the theory of reference and the theory of scientific practice. Talking about intervention, about doing things, of course, when technification is developed, for example, the history of the development of stone tools, maybe you know there are lots of refinements and schools and techniques, and when this is reconstructed, it is seen that you can distinguish the tools by the school they belong to. They learn from a certain way of doing those stone tools, and they can be distinguished into school spirits, etc. So that means they have this standardized procedure that was taught to other people on how to make a tool. But in the case of observation, that's also the case. For example, when cities had to measure fields, how do you measure a field without technification? I mean, you get lots of people and you say, okay, which is bigger, this or that? Well, I mean, it's absolutely impossible to have an intersubjective agreement that way with our natural observation. So the technification of observation, for example, the development of somebody might have thought, okay, maybe we can use a stick that is just the same length and see how many sticks across and how many sticks along these measures, and we compare this with the other one. For example, this idea of distributing just exactly the same land size, etc. No? This agri-measure, etc. The development of weights for commerce. You have a bag of something and another bag of something. Are they the same? Well, it's difficult just by having a look at them, or even by weighing them one by one. It might be complicated. So these scales are inventions for the technification of weighing. And in my opinion, that's the technification of observation. Those are examples of the technification of observation. Even counting, in my opinion, is an example of the technification of observation. That's the standardized procedure for reducing the difference in performances. No? I don't know, you have a big group of people or whatever, just by having a look at them, it's difficult to say if it is bigger than that or whatever, but with this procedure of counting, this standardized procedure, you can say, okay, this is bigger, that is bigger. Okay, something else which is important is these have enhanced human capacities for intervention and perception of these standardized procedures for doing things or for observing things. And technification has promoted and been enhanced by the invention of scales, all kinds of scales for measuring temperature or whatever, tools, the calibration of tools. So as you see, all of this, as described as a process of technification, is a fruitful area for thinking of the details of how these things are developed and have improved and enhanced the human capacities. Of course, this also means that multiple methods for technification have and can be invented, as Alicia was just saying, and the same as Lorenzo. No? There is no one way of doing this. There are multiple ways, and that is precisely very eco-located and situated, and well, imagination, intuition, experience, adaptation are crucial for the invention of technification procedures, scales, tools, etc. And something, how this touches with what I was saying, technification contributes to the pragmatic definition of reference in the case of the sciences, of the European sciences. In my opinion, a very important development of European science was incorporating this technification of intervention and observation, and this allowed to refine abilities for the determination of reference, for this pragmatic determination of reference. I will provide just one example here, which I think is quite interesting. Neumann and PRINCIPHIA, 2002, described the case of this alchemist, Alexander von Suchten. He was, of course, trying to transmute metals into gold and silver. But what is important is that he recognized his failure. And this is, well, I'm summarizing a lot, but the book is quite interesting. At first, it seemed he had succeeded for him because just by this natural observation of the metals, they seem to be gold and silver. So he seemed to have succeeded, but then he also performed some more traditional pragmatic processes. We know gold and silver are used for specific things like jewelry and, well, things of the sort. No? So by this, ductility and resilience of these metals are very well known by people who work with these metals. They can see differences in ductility or resilience They can realize, for example, if they cannot be laminated as thinly as others, well, that is not gold. Or if it cannot be made into a very fine cable, it might not be silver, etc. No? So these are pragmatic ways, and you can see here, when you have an expert, the stereotype of an expert is a lot more refined than the stereotype of anybody else, because this expert has a lot more experience with the thing that he uses the term to refer to. A veterinarian has a lot more experience with dogs. He has put his hand into many dogs or whatever, something we haven't had this experience of. So his stereotype of a dog is also refined by these interactions with a dog. So the same metallurgian or somebody who works with metals has this refined stereotype of what gold is, of what silver is, by seeing how thin it can be made into, etc. But something interesting here is that his metals passed these pragmatic tests, so they could be used as gold or silver for the purposes they were used in the 16th century. So notice how interesting this is. From a non-scientific point of view, those were gold and silver, because you could not tell any difference by having a look at them, by using them to make the things that were made with silver and gold. But nevertheless, there were these assay techniques by the time, which is this technified observation. Well, some centuries before, people had realized that gold and silver dissolved differently in what we now call nitric acid, and they called aqua fortis. This is also an interesting example of what I was just telling. They call this an acid, what we call now nitric acid, they call it water. That was called a special kind of water, but it was called water. And then a combination of nitric and hydrochloric acid was called aqua regia. Again, it was called water, but, well, now we call it acids and a combination of acids. But what is interesting is that, so they had realized that there is this interaction. Silver and gold dissolve differently in these substances. So he made a test and they failed. So his metals could have been used as gold or silver and wouldn't have been told apart by just inspecting them. But by this technified observation of dissolving them into these acids, he, having this more refined stereotype, he said, well, they are not gold or silver because they didn't pass this standardized procedure for checking if they are gold or silver. Now, we have normally thought, when describing the practices in European science, that the empirical component is experiment. But I think that is wrong, because experiment is the control of variables, which is important, but we do not always have this control of variables. We sometimes have just this, what I call what I call the technification of observation or of intervention. And sometimes we can have experiments without technification, but we can also have experiments with technification. So they can, the technification of observation and intervention can and has been associated with experiment. But they are not exactly the same, they're not necessarily the same. Astronomical observation is basically technification of observation rather than experiment, because you're not controlling variables. So in my opinion, it should be better to distinguish them when doing philosophy of science, history of science, sociology of science, or whatever. And again, measurement has also been a term used to describe this, the empirical part of European science, but it is just one of the possible outcomes of technification. Somewhere else I describe this in more detail, how by inventing and developing different kinds of scales, measurement can come about, and in my opinion, this can also produce different kinds of commensurability. Something else, again, which has to do with what Lorenzo and Alicia were saying, imagination, experiential interaction, abduction, and vision seem to have been more important for the development of European science and technology than what has been acknowledged in recent theories of scientific practice. And this has to do with something that has started calling my attention recently, how axiologies are important everywhere. And in this case, the axiologies for European epistemology or methodologies in research, etc. Deriving from the history of European science that yesterday was, where we were talking with Lorenzo, this adoption of Aristotle and Plato, and how this was different. Like Aristotle, of course, influenced a lot the development of European science in practice, but how Plato influenced a lot the teaching of everything when adopted by the Catholic Church. Maybe you know that Aristotle and Peripatetics, etc., had a very different way of learning than the way we have. And but the way we have is was developed basically by the Catholic Church when they adopted academicism by Plato, this idea of academia, etc. No? So, and from them, we also have had, for example, a lot of axiologically reason very high up in the axiological scale, while things like intuition or even abduction, as Lorenzo was saying, imagination have been, even this experience, this experiential interaction, this doing things by, or thinking through doing, has had a secondary, tertiary role, or has been forgotten a lot. So, well, I think some of the most important conclusions from this are this. I'll finish very quickly with this. So, by having these pragmatic aspects into the theory of reference on how these stereotypes are refined by pragmatic interactions, and in the case of European sciences, by the pragmatic interactions that are also more specific through technification of intervention and observation, where you have two different theories, and it can be, a system for technification can be developed that touches upon terms used by both theories, then you have a bridge for commensurability there, but only there. As long, for example, in astronomy, the observational procedures are a bridge for comparing, for example, Ptolemaic astronomy with Galilean astronomy, because the procedures for observing and for determining the position of stars or planets are the same, So as regarding the position and the prediction of the positions of planets, those are commensurable between those theories, because there is a system for the technification of that observation. So well, there are some more developments. I don't have the time now to go deeper into that, but that's basically what I wanted to share with you.
So we have time for questions, comments. Thanks. Okay. So,
Alicia Pasos?
Well, I think you are arguing in favor of commensurability of different paradigms. Okay. I think you can do two different things. One thing is to say there is no incommensurability among paradigms, but they are not paradigms because for definition, two paradigms are paradigms when they are at least locally uncommensurable. So I think that from your argument of the signification of experimentation, you are arguing that there are no different paradigms along the history of at least Occidental science. And there is another different argument that I don't know if you have, but you can make from the reference causal theory of meaning. I think from the causal theory of meaning, you can defend there is comparability even between paradigms. So they can be called uncommensurable by the definition explicitly have. And even if two paradigms were uncommensurable, they could even be comparable, because if you use a reference causal theory of meaning, two different concepts, for example, water in one paradigm and water in another, are incommensurable because they overlap. And when two concepts that about the same things overlaps, they are incommensurable by definition. But this overlapping has got individuals in common, because with the theory of reference, individuals are the same. So you can have incommensurability and comparability inside the Kuhnian concept of paradigm. So you don't need signification of experience to argue in favor of comparability. Because signification, I think, it is very important, because science, maybe because Kuhn do not realize about the objectivity of observation across parallels, but this leads you to deny incommensurability. And the other arguments, the arguments around Putnam theory, is different because it allows incommensurability and objectivity across parents. I think both arguments are different. I don't see very well how you combine them.
Okay. Well, I'm not arguing that there is no incommensurability. I agree with Kunda and with Firehaven that there is incommensurability and there is a serious trouble for European science. In my opinion, it should receive more attention from the philosophy and the education in science. But what I'm saying is that commensurability can be built. It can be built. And basically, my idea is that it is built through this the development of similar stereotypes for the reference of some of the terms within theories. This development can be done without technification. It can be done without technification, of course, but in my opinion, you still need this pragmatic component for the theory of reference. In my opinion, just causal theory, like the causal theory by Kripke or by Putnam, is not enough to account for the building of common reference. As I was telling you with this example of the thought experiment by Putnam, if you are not paying attention to the fact that we take a lot into consideration things like, what do we do with that? If we can drink that and we can wash our clothes with that, etc., we are tempted to say, well, this might be water, even if chemically different. Maybe what needs to be reviewed is our chemical theory, and that is why incommensurability is so important also, because that would be a completely different paradigm. If we decided that we better have a theoretical change in our theory of chemistry to incorporate this liquid that is exactly the same as water, but is not has not the same composition as water on Earth, that is a complete change of paradigm, in my opinion. So yeah, I'm not saying that there is no incommensurability. I'm saying there is. It is quite important, and commensurability can only be built very specifically with effort. You need to put a lot of effort. You need to put a lot of imagination into it. You need to put a lot of intuition, a lot of experience in the building of commensurability. And of course, when this is not done, I agree also with Kuhn that the solution tends to be politics. The most powerful researchers impose their point of view, and that's it. So that's another reason why I think it's important to acknowledge this, because otherwise it's politics what defines the history of science.
Okay, so thank you. This history of philosophy of science, thanks to Kuhn, was of course also interpreted as an attack to the rationality of science. This is not good, because we need to trust the fact that at least science obey to objective criteria to decide, when you have two theories, which is the best one. So your solution is good, because First of all, there is the reference to the evidence that can be shared between two theories and, as you say, can be built. But not only. Paul Taggart, that together with me, we promoted in 1998 the first conference of model-based reasoning, has built the theory of the explanatory coherence, that is a way of rendering more detailed the comparison between theory, and there are also other criteria that can be used, because, of course, the term mass is different in Newtonian theory and in relativistic theory. Okay, so they are two different meanings. But you can, for instance, see if a theory is more simple, not in the sense of easy, of course, but the shape of the theory, the mathematical content. You can see, for instance, if the theory is more structured. This is another good quality of a theory, and if there is the presence of analogies that already worked in the past, and so we can save at least science from this attack and the fact that it is an irrational enterprise. And you know that there was also a moment in which Kuhn said that a theory wins when all the sustainers of the old theories are dead. That is terrible, because we lose in this case also our trust in science. So thank you for your solution of the problem. In which way?
Yeah, thanks a lot.
This way.
Yeah, well, I agree. I totally agree with that. In fact, my tutor here, Larry Lodan, also pointed to that the solution for this problem of for the rationality of science. But I kept puzzled by this thing of reference, and so that's the reason. Well, I had also started in the history of science, and then came into the philosophy of science, and was puzzled by this since I started doing history. So that's the reason why I have continued developing this idea. And well, yes, I agree. There are other criteria for rational comparison, but well, this contribution, if anything, is basically for terms and reference and the possibility of that kind of comparison.
Okay.
Carlos, thank you very much. Look, I will try to make the link between compusualability and pragmatic theory of reference and classical logic. If you want to say something about that, super, no? Okay, but you know, in philosophy of language, one important subject is what is the reference or meaning of the language. And the reference and meaning is not the same thing, okay? So, do you believe the mental content is important to say something about the meaning of the one word, a stable, for example? No, a stable, okay, right. Shared table, okay. For example. So, in this sense, are you a psychologist, or what is your difference between psychology and pragmatic criterion semantic?
Yeah, well, basically, what I said, I think my proposal is a refinement on this theory by Putnam for stereotypes. Yeah, I agree totally that it is not the same as meaning. In meaning, you could have definitions, but in my opinion, that's different, and needs a different kind of treatment. But I think Putman was on the right track when he believed that different people will have different stereotypes for table, chair, or whatever. But the only thing I didn't see him pointing out to, and I think that makes my disagreement, for example, with his thought experiment, is these pragmatic things. That we use tables for something, and by using tables for something, we develop our stereotypes differently. And again, that's why I mentioned the experts. An expert can have a definition of whatever you want, but that is not the same as how his reference works, or her reference works, because his or her reference works, in my opinion, by the stereotype he has developed or she has developed by interacting with dogs, if you're a veterinary, with people, if you're a doctor, etc., etc. That is part of your stereotype for reference. And if you are a carpenter, your stereotype for a table is different from us, because the way you have interacted with tables. And so that's the reason why I had this example of Alexander von Suchten. He was an expert in using gold and silver at that time for doing whatever was made there. By this expertise, he could not tell his metals from gold or silver. So from this theory of reference, where you incorporate these pragmatic aspects, he had been doing things with gold and silver for years or decades. He could not tell the difference. But there, as I said, in the case of this incorporation in European sciences of signified observation, he had different procedures for also checking whether the reference was the same. I mean, that was, he could call his metals gold and silver or no. So I would say that is the difference, basically, the incorporation of these pragmatic criteria, which can be quite natural or it can be technified. I don't know if that is an answer.
Yes.
Or
yeah, it's interesting. But my question is, so what may possibly when we are, for example, and you have one
stereotype
mental representation. I had one also, but you and me know that we are talking about the same. Yes. And so in these cases, I think the concept, not your representation, no pragmatic criteria, the concept is that the fundamental criteria for arts conversation.
Well, I would disagree. The example of the thought experiment with Putnam tries to show that. I would say the concept plays a part in reference fixing, but I would also say that we cannot state that we always have the same reference. I think that basically reference overlaps. A child with his stereotype of a dog and a veterinary with his stereotype of a dog, they have some overlapping, but they don't have exactly the same reference, I would say. And of course, concepts could be part of it. And that's the reason why in this thought experiment, when you find this water that is X, Y, Z, some people might be tempted, if they are too linked to concepts, to say that is not water because it is not H2O. But that's not the only reasonable stance. Some other people would be, well, why not? If we can drink it, if we can wash our our clothes, we can swim in it, etc. It is water, and that's why I was saying I don't think there is a simple or only way of sorting out that situation. Both possibilities are sound. So some people would say, okay, there are good reasons to keep our concept that water is H2O, but some people would say, no, maybe we need to change our concept, change our theory, because pragmatically, this is, for example, I would go a little bit further. If that liquid can be used as water, in substitution of water, in all the industrial procedures we have, I would say maybe we would be more tempted to review our chemistry than to keep on calling water only what is H2O. Because of this pragmatic, you see, in my opinion, the more you incorporate pragmatic considerations, the more there is coincidence in reference, coincidence. But there is always some sort of overlapping, but not perfect coincidence. I don't see how perfect coincidence could be possible.
Thank you. So we are on time. So thank you so much, Professor Carlos Lora Gonzalez. Let's get your hands. And so we have a coffee break. You can find coffee and break in the ice load. And we take 20 minutes and we see you here for the next conference. Thank you. No, se mueve solo. O bueno,
Bueno,
si puedes estar en
de
el
pre-
centro, si no puedes estar aquí.
I know. You're the only person that takes seriously that paper.
I didn't realize that you want to send papers.
I am.
Immediately.
Okay.
Good. Because it was your article about production was open.
Yeah. I tried to do that. Yeah. No. Thank you for reading it and taking it
You
seriously.
know, Luis Estrada,
Gonzalez.
it is not a particularly strange. It is common, I think. Estrada.
No, not that common. No? Maybe here at the university, it's
No, of course, in
for
general,
you.
in general, not at UNAM. Indeed, I found you checking UNAM,
Yes.
but there was also an actor.
No,
Maybe.
filmmaker,
Yeah.
No, a film director, yeah.
You need to see it in here now, Luis Estrada.
Not interested in logic.
Okay, so we can start. We have the theory conference of today. So we have Professor Luis Estrada Gonzalez with his talk titled Connectivity and Abduction. So Professor Estrada, the show is yours.
Thank you. First, I should apologize because I changed the topic of my talk. Apologies also. And that is because yesterday Lorenzo said some interesting things about the connection between abduction and non-classical logic. He said at some point, maybe you recall, that some forms of abduction are fallacies, more generally invalid in classical logic, but they are not so in the light of non-classical logics. And yeah, that makes sense for me, but maybe if some people here in the audience should look specific, particular example of how that can happen, right? And that's what I'm going to do today. And yes, and as Lorenzo knows, I once worked in abduction, and that was my only work on abduction ever, because I said everything I wanted to say about abduction by then. And that's the first reason. And the second reason is because I have something like abduction for free in many of the logics I like the most, namely connexive logics. In connexive logics, I have some forms of abduction for free, and that's great for me. At some point, I promised not to talk more about abduction, especially because I have strong disagreements with Atocha Alicera, and I don't like to disagree with her in that topic. But I mean, this is a special occasion. Lorenzo is here. Maybe I can break my promise just for today. Thank you. So, connectivity and abduction. This is the plan for today. I will first present the usual argument to consider abduction or abductive arguments as fallacies or invalid arguments. Then I will present some examples of how logical notions should be regarded as logic relative. If something is a fallacy or invalid, that is relative to a logic. And maybe in a different logic, the situation is different. Maybe in a different logic, something which is invalid in classical logic is not in that logic. And yes, all this is related to the problem of implications with false antecedents, as we will see. And that's a huge topic, in logic, and especially in the logic I like the most. Exploit probably all the logical works related to Aristotle and his followers. And then I will show you an alternative proposal. And if there is time, I already say this. I already mentioned the connections with connectivity. If there is time, I will say a little more.
Some meta connection.
No, just regular connections. Yeah. So here is a very common thought about abduction. People say, well, look, abduction is very useful. It is very important in many cognitive enterprises, in sciences, daily life, even mathematics. Despite that, it is not valid. It is a fallacy. Let's see what I already told you. Suppose that you have some observation, that is true. And suppose also that such observation is some hypothesis. And then this form of abductive tells you that one of those stages is true. More formally, you have observation, and then several explanations. At least one of those hypotheses.
Disculpen, se nos fue internet.
Counterexample to this abductive argument. This is just logic 101. In order to have a counterexample, you need true premises and a conclusion which is not true. So you can have true premises, just assign the truth to the observation, and then you can make all these implications true by making the antecedent false. And that's it.
because this is the disjunction of all those antecedents, the disjunction is false. So this is a counterexample to at least this particular form of abductive argument. Yes, and classical logician says, look, this is a fallacy, and this is invalid. Maybe it is useful, but logically it is defective. Well, yes, here is a demonstration. It's not logically good. But I think it's not right. Okay, and this is not right because, in general, a logic is not always what people call classical logic. And this is my short for classical logic, which means Frege-Russell's logic. And because logic is not always classical logic, this doesn't hold that the argument is valid or invalid in classical logic doesn't entail anything in general about the validity or invalidity of such argument in a different logic. And this is an important note. The claim that the argument is valid in a logic, in some logic, doesn't entail that such argument is valid in classical logic. Because that is a very common conception of non-classical logics. All of them are always included in classical logic, right? Non-classical logics simply lack things from classical logic, and they are included. But that is not the case. We have non-classical logics which are not strictly included in classical logics. So yes, they are not always so classic. And also, this claim that the argument is a fallacy according to classical logic doesn't entail that the argument is a fallacy in any other logic. Something which is a fallacy in classical logic might be a perfectly valid argument in a different logic. And here you have some examples. You have this. I will use this for a generic implication, and this N for generic negation. And this would say, look, if you have that A implies B, then logically it is not the case that A implies the negation of what it already implied. This is known as Ulisses' thesis in some works in logic, and you know, or if you don't believe me, it is not valid in classical logic, but it is valid in connective logics. And you also, and this happens not only with arguments in pure logic, but also more generally with theories. For example, you may have the piano axioms together with Church's thesis, which is the claim that every function in the natural numbers is recursive. And this entails a contradiction. Well, this is so if you are working with classical logic, but you do not obtain such a contradiction if you are working, for example, with intuitionistic logic. So yes, in general, logical notions, or at least notions such as validity, invalidity, being a fallacy, and so on, are logic relative. Okay. As I have told you, the counterexample to abductive arguments in classical logic depends heavily on some implications with a false antecedent. That's the only way that you can produce the counterexamples with the implications with false antecedents. That is probably, we will see. Let's check first the argument the classical logician gives to support the idea that implications with a false antecedent should be true. And the argument, one of the arguments, goes as follows. First, classical logicians suppose that every formula is either true or false. Second, the classical logician supposes that if A and B are true, then the implication is true. Then the classical logician also supposes that if A is true and B is false, this implication is false. So those are part of the truth and falsity conditions for the implication of classical logic. Next assumption, the classical logician says, well, an implication must be different in general. It must be different from any of its components. It cannot be always, it cannot have always the same interpretation as the antecedent, nor as the consequent. And an implication is not a negation, an implication is not a conjunction, an implication is not a disjunction, and it is not a biconditional. It's an entirely different connective, and that should be respected. Next, if an implication is false and the antecedent is false, the interpretations for the implication would be the same as those for a conjunction. And you can draw the table and consider the case in which the antecedent is false and then put zeros there. The table would look basically the same as the table for conjunction. But this goes against this assumption. An implication is not a conjunction. Moreover, if the interpretation of the implication depends on the interpretation of B with A is false, that means it varies according to the value of the interpretation of the consequent, then the interpretations of the implication are going to be either the same as those of the biconditional or the same as those of the consequent. But this also goes against this assumption. An implication is not a biconditional, and an implication is not all the same as one of its components. So yes, we try to do something else. We try to make it false when it has false antecedents, and we try to make it variable. None of those options worked. So the only option is to make the implication true. That's basically the argument for the truth of implications in classical semantics, right? Okay, in general, you know me, I think that every argument is logically invalid. So, but I'm not going to defend that position right now. My reply to this argument could go in the direction of saying, look, this truth condition, this part of the truth condition is really bad because it says that it doesn't matter that there is no true makes the implication true. I could say that's nice, but I would not say that. Also, I could say some things about the fault condition. I will those to the classical logicians for today. Instead, I would say that this is the problem. The claim that every proposition is either true or false. I think that's the key assumption of this argument. But although all of them are key, I think I can go against this assumption. And if I do so, if I don't buy this claim, then there is the option of saying that if the antecedent is false, or more generally, if the antecedent is not true, then there is room for the implication not being just true, nor just false. You have then more options to interpret the implication. Okay, so here is an alternative proposal, and that's really easy, I would say. Consider a formal language with propositional variables as usual, and disconnectives, negation, conjunction, disjunction. That's the usual stuff. But then I will need a special invitation for this sort of explanative, adaptive implication. You know, I need some meta variables and also some Greek letters for sets of formulas. That's standard. Then I will present apologies for all the people here in the room who already knows this stuff very well. Some others don't. I will explain this as quickly as I can. I did the notion of the model. I don't know for the language I presented. That's important. It is a relation, not a function. A relation between positional variables and the values false and true. So in general, if we are working with a relation, we have 4 possible interpretations for a positional variable. Right? The positional variable maybe just, it might be just false. It might be both true, or it might be either true or false. The classical logician works only with 2 of them, with this and this, right? And for simplicity, we can say that a done valuation is a function. It's just to make things easier. It is a function from the propositional variables to this set of values. And again, relation to a full rotation to cover all formulas. And this can be done in several ways. I will present one very good. But first, some notes. Very importantly, the notion of logic. I would say that the is valid in logic if for every evaluation the conclusion is true or at least false if the premises are true. For the classical logician, this sounds weird in the sense that it is just this is just another way of saying this, because for the classical logician, not all things true makes a difference because we have interpretations. And then I will say that tautology in logic is a formula that follows from every set of premises, and every means every premises in the empty. I need the notion of invalidity as well, because just as I treated truth and falsity independently in the sense that given the conditions will not give me immediately the falsity conditions. Likewise for validity, knowing where an argument is valid is not enough for knowing when an argument is invalid. So these notions should come separate. And the notion of invalidity that I will use here is that an argument is invalid if and only if there is an evaluation in which the premises are true. And there is the conclusion is just false. That will be my definition of logic. Yeah, so we use some evaluation conditions. Here is the evaluation condition for negation. The negation is true if and only if the formula without the negation is false. And the negation is false if and only if the formula without negation is true. Conjunctions easy as usual. The conjunction is true if and only if every component is true. And it is false if and only if some of the components is false. Yeah, and disjunction is equally easy. But the difference comes here, because you have this funny implication, which is meant to represent some form of the implication. And this is true if and only if the antecedent is true in the standard way. And this is just a visual story for the logical connectives, I would say. There is nothing to for the classical logicians to worry about here, because they share this very same evaluation conditions. The only difference is that we have more possible interpretations. We have four, but the classical logician has only two. Okay, so let me say a few words about this funny connective. In the literature, it is known translocation, and it has been discovered in the recent history of logic. I think that the first person to find it in the 20th century was Reichenbach, but after Reichenbach, you have Stephen Blamey. No, before Blamey, actually, Finetti, Blamey, many persons have found this connective because when they were reflecting on the nature of implication, and they were not satisfied by the classical story. So you have the evaluation condition here, and the table looks as follows. Yeah, but actually, that's not the only alternative implicative connective to make sense of abduction as a logically valid argument. In fact, any connective which matches the options here, the options depicted here, would do as well. So any of the implications or the connectives that you obtain by selecting the implications here will function as very much like the translocation I gave you. But as I have said, I like transmutation. There are many arguments in favor in favor of transmutation as a good way of representing some hypothetical reasoning. So that's why I'm focusing on that connected. And let's see how that works. In the case of abduction, some people say, you may know these people, Gabay and Woods. They say abduction is a procedure in which something that lacks systemic virtue is acceptable. I modified this a little bit because it has a virtue of a different kind. Maybe not the best epistemic virtue, but one good enough, right? And we can see that there is a mismatch between the argument and the evaluation. But yes, the idea is that look at these cases in which the antecedent is not true. In that case, the implication is not true either. And then, by the definition of logically valid argument that I gave you, this is a valid argument, and not an invalid one. This is valid. And you can see that H, the hypothesis here, lacks an epistemic virtue, an important one. It is not true. You can see that here. But it is acceptable in the sense that it can be the conclusion of a valid argument in this logic, because it has a virtue of a different kind. Namely, it explains the true observation. Right? So this is just one example in which you can use this very simple logic to represent some of the main guiding ideas behind several adopted projects. And I think that, yes, this is the final slide. What is the connection of all this with connectivity? Well, the connection is the classical logician dislikes the connective thesis because they have counterexamples involving false antecedents. In all these implications, if you put just falsity in the antecedent, you will get immediately a counterexample to the connective thesis, just like in the case of the abductive argument. So they are closely related. They are victims of the same kind of operations. Moreover, both connectivity and abduction started with Aristotle, and I like Aristotle very much. And yes, I have already said this. And yes, many other strongly non-classical projects, like syllogistic, are equally dismissed on basically the same grounds, because of the logical treatment of false antecedents or empty domains or whatever. It's basically the same phenomenon, dismissing some arguments. And I have tried to show you here that there is hope for such kind of projects if you become slightly less classical. And that's it. Thank you.
So we have time for questions, comments,
objections as well.
Thanks for the talk, Luis. We have the first question is in your interpretation of transformation, I mean, this, in order to, I know we can construct the logics without application, and it is a very good work in the knowledge, in the development of knowledge.
Yes.
But I don't, in some cases, we need that the knowledge in logic maybe would help us to understand certain notion.
Yes.
And in the first case, you have an interpretation if and only if it's true, or then,
yes.
If it's true, then
yes.
It is true.
Yes.
But we do not know what is then, because that is the connection in meta language, I think, and maybe we cannot identify when that translocation is true. Or
just
what do you think of it?
I think that this is a general problem for some semantic projects.
Yes, yes.
And it's the same here. No, probably. You are giving your interpretation for conjunction here, and here is the conjunction. And you are giving the interpretation for disjunction, and you have the disjunction here. So in one sense, it's not so surprising that you have the implication here once more, because it's the same for the other connectors. And if you think that's really a problem, then you should start doing something else in order to explain logical notions. Maybe not this kind of semantics, but a different one. But if you are okay, like many other people pretending they are okay with this kind of project, just go ahead. There is no special problem with transportation. It's just the same phenomenon as with the other connectors.
Yes, I think is a lot of less intuitive, maybe, in the notion of them. And we can, in the case of abduction, and I think in a lot of logics, we are in some philosophical aspect try to elucidate the notion of location. And I am, but I know that is the same case in the other connectives, but in this case, I think it could be important.
Yes. Then my next reply would be in order to elucidate this notion that we pretend to not understand, unlike with the other notions. I would say these other notions are equally problematic. We think we understand them, but in fact we don't. So let's pretend we understand them, and this is especially problematic. Then I would say, look at it, let's modify the semantics, let's complicate it a bit more, but just a bit more, and say that the truth of the antecedent should be transformed in a very precise way into the truth of the consequent. And what is that transformation process? Yes. Look at the other evaluation conditions. Use those evaluation conditions to calculate the values, and then on the basis of this assumption, try to obtain this. If you do that, the implication is true. And that's a slight modification in the semantics.
Okay, thank you.
Muchísimas gracias. Great talk. A bit along the question, what do you think? Yeah, do you think they are logical formula?
Do you mean what do I think about this fact that I have several interpretations?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is look at the basic construction. I would say no. I have only two truth values. I started with the truth and the falsity, so there is no plurality on that. I have only two truth values. Where is the plurality? You have more than two interpretations, and that's the key movement. Keeping the notions of truth value and interpretation apart, so you can have several interpretations for the formula. And this heavily depends on your idea of interpretation. If you are happy with a more general one, in which an interpretation is a relation, then you are going to have this form. But if for some reason your notion of interpretation is a bit more restricted, then you are going for something closely to not a relation in general, but to a function. And then you will have less interpretations. Or maybe you like relations in general, but for some reason you say, no, look, this is just crazy mathematics. It is there just because the combinatorics allow that. But philosophically, the notion of interpretation in which a formula is both true and false is meaningless. So there is room for discussing all of the components of the semantics here. I buy all of them. I am okay with this level of generality, but I know that some people are not. Okay.
Thank you very much.
No, thank you.
So we have the questions. So Sandra, Lorenzo, and Alicia. Natalia.
Thank you very much for your talk. My question was similar to David. Because, I don't understand what is the problem that you saw in the condition of falsity in the conditional, because in the case of the true is obvious that the condition for the antecedent and consequent doesn't have a connection, but in the negation condition has a relation.
Do you mean when I was discussing the argument by the classical logic?
Yes.
Yes. Not in the table.
No.
Okay.
In logic.
Yes. Yes. Let me go back to the argument. Transitions. Here, when I say, look, I had more time, I would challenge this as well. This part of the falsity condition, I don't know. Some days I am happy with that, but some other days I am not. In the sense that, as you said, I would look for some implication here as well. And some days I think, look, the falsity condition should be such that from the truth of the antecedent, I should obtain in an implicative way the falsity of the consequent. Not that by mere chance the antecedent is true and the consequent is false. But some days I say I look for a connectivity that takes me, or being false, that takes me from the truth to the falsity. Yeah, that's the kind of problem that I see in this part of the policy condition. Just one more comment. Yes, because some days I feel more constructivist than I should be. So I think that the falsity should be constructive as well, not just true, but falsity as well. So you should construct the false consequence from the true antecedent.
Okay, so it is what I expected from a logician like you.
Yeah,
because of your attitude with respect to abduction that I checked in your article of the past.
Yeah.
So I can classify your presentation as a kind of a quick and elegant vindication of the epistemic status of practical issue from the logical point of view. Do you agree? Yeah. So,
I agree. Yes, thank you. I can take that.
Quick and elegant. So I wanted to ask you, I always find in the community of people interested in abduction, not necessarily logicians, a real difficulty in grasping the fact that you can see abduction from the logical point of view. And that is a particular perspective, okay? And then there are other perspectives. They are not able to make the passage, okay?
Yeah.
What is your opinion? Second question.
Yes.
You said that you are in disagreement with Atocha, that also a producer of logical model of that. Can you quickly explain this disagreement? Thank you.
No, thank you. Well, the first question, as I have said, that was the only time that I worked in abduction. So I never had the chance to really meet with other people from different fields working on abduction. But I am very well aware that people from different fields investigating basically the same phenomenon for some reason cannot communicate. I have seen that, for example, in the case of relevance. Relevance is a phenomenon that is very dear to linguists, but also to logicians. Many people, and for some reason, the logical work cannot find a room in the linguistic side and vice versa.
It's a common disease.
Yeah, it's yes. So yeah, I know that it is the same with abduction. And in the second case, is that we with the code chat, I mentioned very well. It comes to my mind this several years she took as central, but later she decided that it might not be so central. And perhaps the more important disagreement here is our views about the structural rules, because I think that we can have abduction by modifying the reasons, but she prefers modifying the structural rules in order to accommodate abduction. That's I would say important disagreement between the two of us. Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, I tend to answer because he asked one of the things I was going to ask.
Okay.
And the answer is very important for me to ask the next one. I told Lorenzo yesterday that the general form of an abduction is the form of a fallacy of affirmation of the consequence, where the first premise have the hypothesis, and you have the hypothesis and the conclusion.
Yes.
And I think that your difference with Atocha, that was the first thing I was going to ask you. Your difference with Atocha is a difference of tools, but the general forms I just mentioned is the same. It's a form where you have the hypothesis, the premises, and the conclusion. The idea of conditional. This is important because this is the form of an argument that aims at justifying the hypothesis. And justifying the hypothesis, as positively said, is different from the process of creativity to arrive to the hypothesis. And I remember yesterday, Lorenzo told me, well, but this is the classical form, the format where the hypothesis is in the premises and is in the conclusion. Yes, this is a classical form, and this is what we have to change. Okay, yes, we have to change this if we want to introduce in the arguments the creativity. But I think this is not necessary if what I want is to get an argument that justifies a hypothesis. Because this is different from an argument that tell me how do you create a hypothesis. So I agree with you that what you are doing is important. It's not, in the sense that it is not the classical model. You have modified the form when you modify the conditional, because the problem of the classical deductive or the classical form with the conditional material or the deductive material does not give justification the conclusion. And you are given a reason why you have epistemic reasons from the premises to conclude the hypothesis. And this is a problem absolutely different and important than the problem of creativity of the hypothesis. Are two different things, and you are facing one, yes, and you are getting outside the classical model. Yes. This is not classical in one sense.
Yes, too many topics there. First, I am not sure that I have changed the classical evaluation conditions. I think if they are the same as always. The only change comes from the number of available interpretations I have. So I think that's the difference, but I haven't modified the evaluation conditions. And in that sense, I am not the target of many people saying, you're changing the subject, you're not talking about the same things as the classical division, and you should be talking about that. I don't know. I don't know if I should be talking about that same stuff, but I think I am doing that too. The difference comes from elsewhere, not from the evaluation conditions, but of the number of interpretations. That's one thing. And the second is, yes, this is just a toy logic, just to illustrate Lorenzo's point that what is a fallacy in one logic, it is actually a valid argument in a different logic. This doesn't pretend to be some the full logic of adoption. And because for that you would require not only this thing, for example, but actually some mechanism that tells you which of these options is the good one, or which are the good ones among all of them. I think this is not so difficult once you become a non-classical person, because you have more options. But this can be incorporated in this framework, this selection mechanism, because you have several interpretations. You can devise a procedure to select the good hypothesis according to the kind of interpretation that the hypotheses have. For example, if you have an interpretation, a hypothesis which is both true and false, maybe that is not as good as one hypothesis, an hypothesis that is just true. But there are several ways of accommodating that. The other part that you mentioned, that of creating hypothesis, that's tricky. But because I am a non-classical logician, I believe that we can achieve everything we want, basically, even the completeness of arithmetic. I think we can achieve that, and I don't see in principle any obstacle to fully develop this part of adoption as well, that of creating the hypothesis, because this is just a special case of completing an argument. Typically, you complete an argument by putting the conclusion here, but you can miss some part of the premises as well, and that's a logical process as well. Not putting here things here, but also putting things here as well. And if you have enough time, you can devise a logic in which that happens. Perfect. But I haven't showed that, and that's true. That's my fault, not the fault of the framework.
This is very brief historical remark. What do you mean by empty antecedents in Aristotle? Because in the Analytica, all the categorical propositions have actually existential import. As you remember, the Lukashevich reconstructions of Aristotle's resistance actually adds existence.
Yeah, I think that's tricky. I'm not entirely happy with Lukasiewicz's reconstruction of the syllogistic, precisely because of that emphasis on existential assumption. Because I think two notions are being conflated here. The notion of the terms having a delimitation, and that's not the same as saying that because of the term has a delimitation, then you have existential import. That's these two things are conflated in classical logic, I would say, because of why, but I don't see that neither in Aristotle nor in other logicians, for example, Leibniz. So, yeah. Yes, I know. Yeah, and the problem of the false antecedents, you have that in analytical theory, because at some point when he's discussing, not exactly, yes, no, exactly that. There is a very nice paragraph in which Aristotle uses this to prove something else, and it has to do. It is a very nice paragraph about what are we going to make of the falsity of the premises in a syllogism, and this is just another incarnation of Aristotle's thoughts on that. Look, it is not that nice if antecedent and consequent have different polarity. If they belong to radically different categories, then you are not going to have implication or syllogism or anything like that. Having these two different kinds in one side and the other is very problematic for him. And that's general, because it's the same problem here. If this thing is positive, but this is negative, that's problematic for Aristotle, and he makes a proof of a related claim in that very paragraph of the analytics. So, but, no, I agree. It's difficult to know what Aristotle was saying exactly, but I am pretty sure that he didn't say what Garcia would say Aristotle was saying. Yes.
Well, we are actually preparing a colloquium on Aristotle's logic, so
yeah.
I think that I invite you.
Yeah. Thanks.
Does anyone else have a question?
You consider the mystic the condition?
Yes. No, I haven't.
Well, let's say many possibilities.
Yeah, but that was my way of representing several tables at once.
Yes, well, my question was why did you choose transmutation instead of another of those?
The answer is here. And yes, yeah, I tried to say something about this. One reason is that it is among those possible connectives, transmutation is the one which does the best job in accommodating implications with non-true antecedents. Other connectives that do not have the uniform policy of making the implication neither true nor false have strange consequences. They validate things that are, I don't know, I need imagination to find cases in which those connectives produce something interesting. That I think that the case for classification is straight. It accommodates abduction and connectivity and syllogistic many things directly without telling long stories about it. But that's the reason.
Okay. I have some questions, but I will not attack you with that. Only, can you go to the slide 10, please? Yes. Definition of validity.
Yes.
You have, okay, conclusion is true, but not false.
Yes.
And premises true.
Yes.
I have the curiosity of why not conclusion false? So in the normal ways we have, if the premises are true, then conclusion is true, but it's true does implicate not false, but that's one curiosity for me. Why do you need to have zero, not zero in A?
Because that is what allows me to have this kind of ampliative reasoning. Because at some point, among the interpretations, you are going to find true interpretations here, and the conclusion is not going to be either true nor false. And I need that to be a good reasoning, going from true things to non-false ones. In order to represent this. Maybe, look, maybe the premises have the right epistemic virtue. But then you can get from that something which is not as good, but still good enough. And not being just false is good enough in this sense. It has, it is a virtue of another kind. Maybe it's not the truth, but no, look, it is enough that it is not false. I can work with that. It's only because of that, in order to accommodate this kind of ampliative reasoning.
So it's not only for I can, it's for some philosophical commitments about this.
Not really commitments, it's just the need to represent in a straight and easy way some ideas. Yeah. Because if you ask me, oh, abduction is this thing, well, I don't know, but people that knows more than me say things like this, and it would be nice to have a logic which can represent that idea, which is widely held. So yes, there is some sort of intuitive support to the notion of logical validity there. And there is independent support as well, because it is a notion of validity that it is being used in other domains. For example, with people that that want to deal with paradoxes, sometimes like a notion of validity like that.
There is no problem with the premises. Premises could be true and even false.
Yes.
This formulation. Only the conclusion not false. With these reasons.
Yeah, not just false. If the conclusion is both true and false, that's fine because it is true.
But you cannot, because zero is not an element of the conclusion.
You can. The truth,
Yes.
and maybe with the truth comes the falsity. But if that doesn't happen, then make sure that falsity is not there.
Okay. So you can have 0 and 1.
Yeah.
But not just 0.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
No, thank you.
Okay. So thank you so much, Luis.
No, thank you.
I would like to conclude, David.
Thank you, Alejandro. We are very grateful for the assistance, the attendance of these conferences, and we have a time for a meal, and we come back at 3 o'clock. 3 o'clock, please, with the conference of Magdalena, and then conference of Mauricio Guerrero. Thank you.
Thank you.